Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Ries with us. Eric, thanks for coming on the program.
Hey, thank you.
Absolutely. Now, Eric, you don't really need an introduction. Some of our other guests need introductions. You don't. You're the founder of the Lean Startup Movement. I was actually telling my wife today before I came here, I said, of the 150 interviews I've done, his name or his book or his movement has probably been brought up in half of them. I was like, that's how much he's affected the way we think about startups. You authored the book Lean Startup, you conduct the Lean Startup Conference, and much, much, much more. So really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
Yeah, you're very kind. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so let's just jump in here. I read the book, and I follow your stuff for the last couple of years. As far as I can tell with the lean startup stuff, the genesis of it is lean manufacturing. That's kind of where some of the ideas came from. So who were the original lean manufacturers and what made them lean? Because I feel like the more we know about the genesis, the more we can actually know about what it means now.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. When I talk to startup folks for whom lean means lean startup, they're like, why are we talking about manufacturing? It's not very interesting. And interestingly, there's, of course, a gigantic worldwide lean community on the manufacturing side. They're like, why are we talking about startups? So I did an interview just like this yesterday with a lean manufacturing a podcast series, and for them it's like it's a completely different set of questions and a different set of confusions. Like, wait, what does that have to do with startups? And what's interesting about it is I have no background in manufacturing. My background is purely in startups, in tech and software. But when I was building companies, I was using techniques that now are considered pretty commonplace because they're part of lean startup. But at the time, they didn't have a name. People thought they were a little bit crazy, and I was struggling to explain to people, not just to show them that they worked, but explain why they worked. So there was a body of work around customer development, and not that people understood that, but at least there was some stuff around that. But when we started to take these ideas into engineering and software startups and actually build products this way, people found it pretty confusing. And so I was lucky that I encountered this body of theory really about manufacturing called lean manufacturing.
Yeah.
That really helped me understand not just what these techniques are, but why they work. What is the underlying mechanism by which they work?
Yeah.
And so for those that are new to that, I'm not familiar with lean manufacturing, most of it comes from a company called Toyota that most people know. People forget now. We're used to thinking of Toyota as the world's largest auto manufacturer, but after World War II, it was a tiny company that made a bunch of industrial products. Cars was not even their main product line. And post-World War II Japan, the economy was terrible. Capital was extremely scarce. And they were forced to compete in a global market all of a sudden with true mass manufacturers like we had in the United States, like General Motors and Ford, basically running the most advanced version of the Ford production system, that Henry Ford had invented in the early 20th century. And so they were put in a position where they had to figure out, how do we produce the same variety and quality of cars as those mass producers when we can't afford to set up the economies of scale in the big style factories? And they developed a series of techniques. The original people that did it are men like Taiichi Ohno, who was considered the father of the Toyota production system, a man named Shigeo Shingo, and a lot of people credit an American named W. Edwards Deming, who went to Japan at that time and was teaching statistical quality control. People who've heard about that, total quality management, those are buzzwords from a previous century. He really was the one who convinced the Japanese they should take this seriously. So some combination of those guys figured out this alternate way to produce stuff that when the rest of the world found out about it, they actually thought it was magic. And it's hard to explain to people who've never been in a factory, don't know a lot about manufacturing, why these techniques seem so magical. But the reason it's called lean is in the old style factories, you'd have a bunch of machines that produce parts, and then each part becomes an input for the next part. And you have inventory of each part to make sure that the machines were busy 24/7. So you keep a big buffer of inventory in between, and you just run every machine as fast as possible to produce as many parts as possible. And so the factories pre-lean were filled with extra inventory of parts that was considered an asset that the factory would have to manage and store and retrieve and all this stuff. And at the heart of lean was a recognition that actually work-in-progress inventory, the parts that are between the stations, are actually a liability, not an asset. Because let's say you find a problem in the design of a part, and you have to change the way it's made.
Now you got to
If you have
double
an
on inventory.
if you got an inventory of 1 million parts, you either have to throw that inventory away or wait for all those million parts to be used till the new one can come into place. And
Gotcha.
so I'll get to the point about startups. I know it seems everyone I talk to startups, they're like, well, why are we going on this detour? But I promise there's a connection. Here's a connection. If you use the techniques of lean manufacturing, then almost like magic, the amount of inventory between stations starts to shrink. And the people doing the work at each station get much faster feedback about whether what they're doing is high quality or low quality.
I got you.
Now, in a startup or in a software company or any kind of high-tech knowledge work, we have a problem. We have masses of work-in-progress inventory, but you can't see it like in a factory.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Every untested assumption, every design that a designer works on that has not yet been implemented, every implementation, every piece of software that has not yet been sent through QA, that's not yet in the customer's hands, that's all work-in-progress inventory. So now, if you look at something like a traditional Scrum or Agile development team that releases once a month, that used to be considered really fast. But now look at it through the eyes of this lean process to say, how much inventory is being shipped to the customer all at once every 30 days? It's thousands of changes, thousands of features. Now, if there's an error, when do you want to find out about it?
As quick as possible.
As quick as possible. So that is the origin of a lot of the thinking around lean startup, is to say, well, how do we apply that same manufacturing mindset around improved cycle time and driving down batch size, but to our beliefs about the customer and the things that we need to learn in order to make our startup be successful.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you kind of went on that detour there. You know, it's not a detour, but it feels like it is the startup people.
I know.
Because
it's history.
There's so much to learn from that. Just that idea of inventory, whether it's invisible inventory or physical inventory, it's a real inventory, and it is not an asset, even though that's the old way of thinking about it. And if startups can get their head around that, the rest of the lean principles just kind of fall into place. That it's really about waste, and if that's the center of the universe, everything sort of makes sense, you know?
I appreciate you saying that. That's how it seemed to me, that like there's a couple of critical first principles from which the rest flow. Of course, not everybody sees it that way.
Yeah.
But I think what's key is, and what's exciting to me is I really thought it was important to build Lean Startup on a foundation of what had come before, so that two things are possible. One, as lean startups grow up, and this is a lot of my work today, is working with companies post product market fit and companies that have had a lot of success and are starting to get to traction. Those companies need not just lean startup, but the traditional lean principles as well. And so we can build a lean enterprise that combines the best of both management systems, right? Lean startup for the situations of the companies in that are high uncertainty, new things, that kind of continuous innovation that every modern company needs. But a more traditional lean management program for, just making the company's regular operations more efficient, making sure that we have respect for every person that works in the production of our product, and eliminating waste, as you said.
I think it might have been O'Reilly who said lean can change everything. It can change government, it can change nonprofits, it can change big business, small business. And, it's odd for us because we learned about it with startups. But think about it. If it can be manufacturing, which is very dissimilar to startups, why can't it also be government and family management and whatever else you want to make lean?
Since the book came out in 2011, so it's now been about 3 years, the number of crazy applications people have put it to has been totally fascinating to see. And you've named it, everything from the biggest organizations in the world, governments, giant companies, manufacturing plants, to all kinds of small and wacky things, including someone recently wrote about how to use Lean Startup in your personal life.
Yeah.
But I have not. I decided not to read it. I didn't want to know.
You need some place for waste, right?
Oh, it's just like I can't go there.
Yeah, at some point you just you don't need everything to be lean. All right, so at the end of the day, what makes one startup lean and one startup not lean? Because like you said, used to releasing once a month was really good compared to waterfall cycles, but now that's not really great because there's people releasing 10 times a day. There's people releasing 50 times a day. So is it just a moving target and there's no way to actually say that's lean and that isn't? Is it a continuum and you're kind of somewhere on the spectrum? Or is there a dividing line that if you're doing these things, you're lean, and if you're doing these things, you're not? How do you see that?
The one of the most important lean principles going all the way back to Toyota is what they call Kaizen in Japan, but in America we should call it continuous improvement. and is a very important part of the mindset, which is that there really are not binary categories of lean and not lean. Too many people like that I encounter, these days want to treat lean like a religion. I get a periodic phone call, I'm not making this up, to basically excommunicate somebody from the lean movement. Someone's like, hey, I saw that somebody's doing something and I don't agree with it, and you gotta make them stop.
Oh,
And I'm
that's
like, listen,
awesome.
I
Pope
don't
Eric.
control. Yeah, I'm not the Pope. I don't control who's in and who's like. These are a set of ideas that are given freely to the world. So if people are going to use them and misuse them, like I do my best to educate and convince and say what I want to say, but I don't. Anyway, it's not a religion, and so I don't ever go around saying that's a lean startup, that's not a lean startup. I don't think that's a mistake. And when we're in a startup, it can be really tempting to say, well, I'm not doing as good a job as that other startup, so I suck. So I should just like curl up into a hole and die. And of course, startups that are savvy know that other startups feel that way, so we put out press that makes us look good and them feel bad. So like, a lot of startups. I remember when I was, really active as a CTO, we would have competitors that were better funded than us, and just everything seemed to be going great for them, better than them. And I was always very confused because in the press, they were the dominant player and they were killing it and everything was going great. But when we would talk to customers would never mention them as a competitor. And I was always like, that's a little bit odd. And then like, I had this experience multiple times where that company is like going amazing, and then one day it's out of business. It's just gone. You're like, well, I thought it was going amazing. It's like, yeah, people are good. Certain companies are really good at putting out the impression, what I call success theater. They put on a show about how good they're doing. The only standard that matters to me in the companies that I work with, work for, invest in is not are we doing better than competitors, better than somebody else, better than I read in a book. Are we doing better than yesterday? So are we improving in the dimensions that really matter? And using that as your yardstick, you'll never be satisfied. So you can never be lulled into a false sense of complacency. And also, you'll never find yourself chasing someone who's like committing fraud or doing something impossible. Right? You're just saying, look, our release cycles were this yesterday, and here are the problems. Like if you're releasing once a month, I can name very specific problems that you have every month practically. That if you could reduce that cycle time down to 2 weeks would basically go away. And that's true from 2 weeks down. And, eventually you get to diminishing returns, but then there's plenty of other things to work on. So, I've talked a lot about the importance of having a cluster immune system so that your software, if you're a software company, your software can automatically detect errors and automatically revert them. In the old lean system, they call this mistake proofing, making your system so easy to use that your employees can't make a mistake even if they want to. So like the infrastructure to build such a thing is quite expensive, takes a long time, has to be built up incrementally over years. And so instead of being like, well, they have this 5-year head start on their immune system and I could never get to it, it's like, don't worry about that. Yesterday you had no immune system. Today could you have something that fixes maybe one problem, that makes one mistake less likely to have, right? Can you incrementally improve so that today you're better than yesterday? That to me is the standard.
Gotcha. So it's Kaizen, it's continuous improvement, it's not in or out. It's not comparing yourself to somebody else. All right, now you kind of mentioned it earlier. A lot of these ideas, you put them out in a certain way in the book, and then they take on a life of their own. People twist them, they make them do things they weren't intended to do. They have their own philosophy around them, which is fair enough. They can do whatever they want. But
That's right.
I want to hear from you. I want to hear about some of these key concepts from you. So let's start with MVP. In your words, what is an MVP? Because some people think it's a landing page with an email capture form, and anything more and you're wrong. Some people think it's much. We're confused. What is an MVP?
Yeah, it's very common. I get a lot of fan mail and hate mail about MVPs, and a lot of time I get a lot of email people saying you got to change the term to something else. And I'm always like, listen, if you can find a term that's worked as well as MVP, I'm glad to switch. But there's a reason we use this term. It's worked, and we haven't found a better one. So yeah, look, people there's a lot of people out there who everything they know about MVP is what's in the word. They haven't actually looked it up or read the book. They haven't looked into it. They just assume they know what it means. So for those that are new to the concept, minimum viable product, MVP, is the smallest experiment we can do that is necessary to learn what we need to learn about the most critical assumption that will power our initiative, whatever it is, startup, company, program, whatever we're doing.
All right.
So the reason why people get confused is, like, I've done this exercise with like tiny little app companies that, where building the whole app is going to take 2 weeks. So the minimum viable product is, basically let's just do the smallest version of the app that we can get in the store. I've done it with plenty of web companies where you're right, an MVP, a landing page MVP is perfectly fine. But I've done this with industrial companies where we're making power plants and engines and airplane parts, where the MVP is incredibly expensive. Just to produce a prototype of the thing will take a year and $10 million. And that's totally fine, because what matters is not, are you going as fast as some crappy app company? The question is, are you the fastest one? Who's trying to, if it's a race to learn the critical things that will power your business model, then who's going to win that race? It's whoever is running fastest, whoever's learning fastest. That's really what MVP is about.
So you're telling me an MVP could take a year and $10 million in the right situation?
Of course. If the it's always about what is the status quo, right? Like in that example, the company was planning the pre-lean plan was to spend 5 years and $300 million. So getting it down to a product a year instead of a product every 5 years is a massive improvement.
Gotcha.
Now, if you're an app company and you pitch me that plan, I'm going to be suspicious. So I think the challenge we have as entrepreneurs is we're very good at talking ourselves into the belief that we're special. And the specialness always is a particular kind of specialness. The specialness that lets us indulge whatever we really enjoy doing.
Yeah. It's
funny
how that
works. If you like building products and not talking to customers and just being in your cave cranking out code, which believe me, I like, it's very easy to convince yourself that you need to take a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. That's pretty common.
Yeah. One thing I've learned is that if I'm too comfortable too often, I'm probably doing it wrong, because the things that are going to work probably make me a little bit nervous and scare me a little bit and make me put in effort in ways I don't want to. So if I'm not doing those things on a pretty regular basis, I'm almost for certain only doing what I want to, which is wrong.
I believe that.
Yeah. All right, so that's the MVP, and you answered my next question already, which was, is there ever a time where the MVP is not the best route and you need something more fully fledged, but it's situation dependent, and you're comparing it against the variables of yourself and yesterday and other people in your industry, not it has to be a landing page and that's the mark.
Totally.
It's a philosophy. It's a real philosophy.
That's right. And look, our whole idea within startup is to try to make this whole process more scientific. And when people hear the word scientific, sometimes they think I mean rote, or you're turning it into a spreadsheet or making it not creative, which I think is a huge insult to the many very creative scientists who have shaped our modern world.
Exactly.
So anyone who thinks that, screw you.
Yeah.
But if you go up to a scientist, imagine you went into a lab somewhere and you said, excuse me, scientist, what is the best kind of experiment? They'd be like, well, for what? And you're like, I don't want to hear for what. No context. The number one best practice, best experiment. Like, is it in a petri dish? Is it in a chemistry set? Is it like, tell me the best experiment. They'd be like, you're a moron. Like, what are you talking about? An experiment is the best, fastest, cheapest, most accurate way to get the information that you want. What are you trying to learn? Then I can tell you the best experiment. MVP is the same way. When people say, what's the best MVP? It's like, well, tell me what you're trying to learn. I'll tell you what the MVP should look like.
Yeah.
But unless you're willing to be explicit about what are you trying to learn, then you're not doing MVP. So don't pretend.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And in my mind, just in this conversation, I'm starting to think minimal viable experiment. And the experiment might be a real product. The experiment might be talking to customers, but it's what is the thing that helps me learn?
Hey, Skype, where's our conversation?
Hey.
Bring it back.
All right, there you go.
Back.
I got you
Bring it back.
All right, I'll make a note to edit right here.
Yeah, take it out in post. Fix it in post.
Yeah, everything's fixed in post. Or I'll just leave it and they can hear us ramble. All right, so, yeah, I mean, just hearing you talk, it makes me think minimal viable experiment. And so for some reason that clicks with me. I like that.
Yeah.
All right, let me ask you about the pivot. Another one of those terms. Some people just absolutely hate it. Some people absolutely love it. Some people say it's the reason they're successful. Some people think it's what's wrong with the world.
Yep.
What is a pivot? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it neither? But here's what I really want to dig into is the kinds of pivots. Because I've seen you post before, like the 10 kinds of pivots. And every time I run across that list, I need to reread it because there's something in it that I need to think about for my own startup right then. And it always gives me great ideas, that simple list of 10 things. So tell me about the pivot a little bit.
I'm glad you say that. It's interesting. Startup advice is really like that. I just want, as an aside, what you just described, that phenomenon of like reading something and having to go back and read it over and over and over again. Startup advice is really like that because everything in startup world is obvious until you're actually in the situation. And then you're like, wait, what am I? It's impossible to convey in writing how confusing and just stressful and crazy things are in a startup. So, I mean, I was talking about Steve Blank in customer development. My copy of the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which which was at the time that I was doing my startup, was really the only book on any of these topics. Mm-hmm. I must have read that book 100 times. Because it would be whole chapters and sections. I'd be like, this is stupid. I don't need this right now. And then like months later, I'd be like, oh my God, I'm having this problem. And I'd be like, I've heard of that somewhere. And I'd be like flipping through, well, isn't there like advice about what to do in this? And I need it right now. So like that's startup advice is like that. And pivots, I mean, is really where it all comes together for me. So first of all, what is pivot? Very simple, actually. A pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. So most of the things that people criticize about pivots don't even fit that definition. So I'm like,
changed their vision. It's not a pivot.
Yeah, did you even check? And like some people are like, every time you make any kind of change, that's a pivot. And it's like, if you just like fix a bug in your product, that's not a pivot. If you make your product easier to use, that's not a pivot. It's just same old product, same old strategy, but like you built a new product. Congratulations. I'm very proud of you. Like I'm very glad that you did it, but don't call it a pivot. And the most recent meme I hear is people criticizing what Peter Thiel calls agnostic experimentation, which is just like instead of having a vision, you just like pivot all the time and figure out what the data will kind of tell you what to do. And it's like, it's such a clear misunderstanding. Like, it doesn't even make sense to me. How could you even have a pivot if you have no vision? It's just like saying you're going to do science with no hypothesis. I just don't understand it. I mean, literally can't understand what people are talking about when they use those, when they talk about those criticisms. So yeah, I think the critical thing to understand about a pivot is it requires having a vision. No vision, no pivot. It's impossible. It's baked into the definition. Now,
no agnostic pivots.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. It's like because people are like, oh, lean startup is about speed and going fast, and that's true. But if you think about acceleration, one way to accelerate really fast is to just run around in a circle and go nowhere. You're going really fast, but you're not getting anywhere. So speed has to be defined with respect to some destination. So pivot is simply saying, look, we had a strategy, right? We're trying to drive from San Francisco to Chicago, and our strategy was drive due north. And like at a certain point, you're doing your strategy, and you're like, you know what? I don't feel like we're getting closer to our destination. I feel like maybe it seemed like a good idea at the time, but now we didn't make a change in route. So, if you have a GPS in your car and you've programmed in you want to go to Chicago, and you're going the wrong way, you can say, hey, give me a new route, help me get there. And you can say, oh, I got to go due east for a while. But you don't ask your GPS, hey, what should my destination be? Like, robot, can you tell me what to do? Like, tell me where to go. Like, you have to have a destination in mind. A pivot is just saying, look, let's admit but the current strategy is not the best one to get to our destination and try something new. And I don't know why that concept should be controversial. It seems actually pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
And you cannot understand the stories of startups without having this concept in your vocabulary. So I don't feel bad about popularizing the word. It's critical to understand that startups go through these strange gyrations where it seems like the thing that they started with and the things they ended up with have nothing in common. But if you follow the pivots, you'll see, no, there's a kernel of truth that they threaded all the way through that only really made sense in retrospect.
Yeah.
And the problem is that when people become billionaires, they tend to have selective memory about the things they were wrong about in the past. And they no longer have anybody around them to tell them that anything they say is less than brilliant.
Yeah.
So what happens is they tend to start to rewrite their own stories, not just publicly, but in their own mind. That makes everything seem smoother and clearer and easier than it actually was. That's just being human.
Yeah. No, and it's funny you mentioned billionaires. I think about how also once you reach a certain level of success, it's almost like you have the right to be right about everything when you have no idea anything about that topic. You've never studied it. You don't have firsthand experience. It's not been a part of your trajectory. And yet somehow now you can just talk about any subject because you're super rich. It's like, it doesn't work that way. But we let people get away with it, though.
Well, it does work that way, I think, is exactly
That's the problem, is it does work that way. We let them get away with it.
Look, and of course, there's tremendous wisdom to be had in studying people who've been successful. And I don't mean to denigrate that,
Sure.
But I do think it's important to ask, when you're taking advice that's of the form, look, I did this, then I was successful. Therefore, if you do that, you'll be successful. You just think logically about it to say, well, how do I know that taking that advice will actually help me? Because keep in mind, most of the people giving that advice didn't actually follow that advice themselves.
Yeah.
They lived it, but they didn't necessarily have someone who tapped them on the shoulder and said, by the way, do this, and then it'll work out. So like they had their own special path. And so you got to really think about how do I really know that advice will apply to me. And of course, the reason I spent so much of my 5 years of my life is developing this theory of lean startup is I'm not trying to tell people, look, I made it and you can too if you just do what I did. I'm trying to say, look, here's a theory that can help you understand the world better and make better decisions. And you should not take my word for it. Like I said, it's not a religion. you should take these ideas, don't take them on faith, go test them out in your own life and see if they work for you. And if they do, maybe try a little bit more.
Yeah.
And if they don't, tell the rest of us so we can all get smarter.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, tell me about some of those 10 pivots. You don't have to go through all of them, but I
Sure.
think they spark ideas. So what are
Yeah.
some of the possible pivots, just to give our viewers an idea?
Sure. The two that I think are the most kind of unique to lean startup discourse, you don't see this written about very often, are what I call the zoom in and the zoom out
I
pivot.
like those.
And zoom in pivot is where you say, look, I have a product with 10 features, but really feature number 10 is the one that matters. It may not be the one that I thought mattered. I always think about PayPal in their early days and their cryptography, Palm Pilot PDA, like cryptography, crypto cache algorithm thing. And it's just like, they had like so many features, of which emailing money to somebody else was like one of the minor features they happened to have introduced. But when they saw people using it all the time, they said, you know what, let's just forget the PDA thing. Let's zoom in and make that one feature our whole product and see what happens. And a lot of great products you can kind of think of that way. You think about Google zooming in on just the search out of the portal. All the kind of simplifying products out there.
Yeah, I think about Bourbon zooms in and becomes Instagram.
Yeah, exactly right. It's just like such a great story.
Yeah.
Zoom out is exactly the inverse, the opposite, where you say, our whole product is actually just a feature of a much bigger product. Sometimes you just realize, oh, I see. It's not enough just to solve this problem for somebody. You got to solve a whole suite of problems. You can't just solve, the organization. You can't just like give people a better email client. You got to give them a whole Office suite. You can't just give people like a better command line. You got to give them a whole operating system. You can't just give people a better app. You got to give them a whole mobile phone. So like there are those situations in enterprise software, and enterprise products are more common. It goes under the term whole product, where you say, like a lot of times you have a technology, but you need to have OEMs or VARs, right? Somebody who can build the product and deploy it in your customer site for you. So you got to go partner with those folks. You're missing some kind of distribution component, or that's pretty common.
Yeah, no, that's great examples. All right, so our audience here is basically obsessed with growth and marketing and those kind of things. So help us connect the dots. How can we apply the lean startup principles to marketing? How can we do the build, measure, learn with marketing? How can we get rid of waste in marketing? Do you have kind of thoughts developed on that? Does it apply directly, or is it nuanced with this in mind?
Yeah, I think it applies quite directly. And there's a couple things I'll say. First is, one of the cool things about Lean Startup is that it really helps us recognize the truth of startups, which is that the product is the marketing is the product.
All right, that sounds deep. Break it down for us.
I know. Functional divisions don't actually make sense in startups. So just because we're used to having an engineering department and a marketing department that do separate things doesn't mean that actually customers see it that way. For the customer, everything that you experience is the product. Customers are incapable of differentiating between something they saw on a website during the landing page process and the actual thing they downloaded onto their computer. It's all the product as far as they're concerned. I was once working on a product where customers literally would get confused about what product they were using because we would allow competitors to advertise on our website. So we would sometimes get customer service complaints about the competitors' products, and they would get them about ours because customers were that confused about what was going on. And unless you're really inside the mind of customers, it's hard to really understand the level of just total confusion people generally live their lives in. And so when you're doing product marketing, you are trying to convince people that you're trying to make something clear that is inherently confusing. And so everything you do counts as the product. So every banner ad you run, every landing page you develop, every marketing technique, every growth hack, everything is part of the product. So that means that your marketing team, your growth team, got to have product people on it, and your product teams have to have marketing people on it. So that's one thing, is we have to work cross-functionally. I think that's a requirement. Second thing is, a marketing campaign is a product. So do you want to do it scientific, or do you want to do it astrology style? That's up to you. But if you want to do it scientific, you got to ask yourself, what am I trying to learn with this marketing campaign? When we talk about growth, we tend to get very selfish and be like, I don't care. I just want the numbers to go up and to the right. Just do whatever it takes. But if you took that idea seriously and said, I really don't care. I just want the numbers to go up and to the right. Just do a Ponzi scheme. That grows fast, right? Sell porn, right? It's pretty. I'm amazed how many people who start doing A/B testing blindly like wind up selling porn pretty fast. It's like that makes the numbers go up and to the right, but is that the business you really want to be in? No. So what are you really trying to learn? Right? It's like if I'm trying to learn how to persuade people to try my product, if that's really what I need to do, then like doing a campaign that reaches 1 million people is probably a bad idea. Because let's say it doesn't convince the first 100 people. How much more do I learn from the 999,900 extra people who my campaign is ineffective for, right? Like to me, the essence of Lean Startup applied to marketing is systematically identifying what are our assumptions, what needs to be true in order for our marketing goals to be met, and then running experiments at the appropriate level of scale to figure out how to do that. So, if you want to reach 1 million people and convince them to try your product, get 100 people to try it first.
Yeah.
And then figure out what did I learn from that 100 that I can apply to 1,000 and apply to 10,000. I hope now this is starting to sound a little bit familiar to the conversation we had right at the start, right?
Conversation.
Because it's the same thing, right? How much extra inventory do you have of untested assumptions, right? Like all the extra people that you touch with your campaign before you figured out if it even is the right campaign or not, that's pure waste and you should eliminate it.
That's awesome. And something you said, some point in the last couple years, the switch flipped in my mind that product is not just the thing on the screen that I input information on when I'm ready to do the thing that you promised me it'll do. Product is every email I get from the company. Product is the conversation I have on the street about the product with somebody. Product is just everything. It's every single point where we are making contact with a user in any way. That's product. And maybe even beyond that in some ways I haven't thought of yet. And when you make that switch, all of a sudden product takes on a new life, and all of a sudden MVP takes on a new life. Because now it's not just MVP with the product lowercase p, it's MVP in every sense of the product. MVP with the email, MVP with the marketing, MVP with the product, MVP with everything. And if you think about it that way, now our marketing campaigns have a minimal viable marketing campaign product that we need to put out and learn and then iterate on from there, right?
Yeah. The other thing I want to mention that I think is critical for your audience is we often talk in products about the value hypothesis and the growth hypothesis. Like it's not enough, in my opinion, to just test to do an MVP and be like, well, customers like my product. I got 5 customers and they like it. If I don't have a plan for how I can turn those 5 customers into 10 customers. So both, it's not that either hypothesis is unimportant. It's that you need both. One or the other is not enough. Value without growth is an art project, and growth without value is a cancer.
All right, okay.
So,
you got to say both those again and slower, because I feel like something really profound is being said there.
Okay, I guess. Listen, it's very simple. Like the product that we want to test in a startup is one that has a value hypothesis and a growth hypothesis. So value hypothesis, if it just creates value for somebody but has no way to grow, then you can't get any kind of impact in it. So it's not bad. It's an art project, right? Like a lot of people are like, I just want to do design for design's sake, and it's like, great, put your work in a museum. But if you're trying to actually create impact and change the world, then that's not enough. And growth without value, I mean, really is a cancer or a Ponzi scheme. Or pick your favorite kind of runaway growth that is ultimately harmful, right? You remember the wave of viral apps in the early days of the web. When people figured out how to do viral address book import stuff, like there were a lot of products that existed just to perpetuate themselves and had no value, and they ultimately crashed and burned. So we don't want to build those kind of products. So we want to be building a product that has both value and growth. And for marketers, I'm surprised how many marketers I work with that don't have a theory of growth. They're just trying to make numbers go up and to the right, and I really think that's dangerous. Most of them are looking at what we call vanity metrics. So like total number of users, total revenue, the gross numbers. It's like the exhaust from the engine. And the problem with using those metrics is you'd be like, look, it's almost like you're thinking like this. A car that's going really fast has a lot of exhaust coming out. Therefore, measure the amount of exhaust to figure out how fast you're going. Now incentivize your team to generate as much exhaust as possible. And you think about that, and now you're like, wait a second. Wouldn't a really good way to generate a lot of exhaust be to throw some sawdust in the engine?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you'll get exhaust that way, but will you get growth? Not really. So all these companies are doing this, generating noise and hype and unsustainable growth to drive those numbers up, and I think that's a bad plan.
Yeah. You mentioned needing a growth theory. What does a growth theory look like? And I know it's going to be different for everybody, but just give us some idea of the contours of a growth theory.
So I believe in something I call sustainable growth, and sustainable growth has a simple one rule. Here's the rule, the law of sustainable growth. New customers come from the actions of past customers. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as your new customers come from the actions of past customers, then as you grow, you'll get compounding type growth because the more customers you have, the more new customers you'll have.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, I've only found 3 theories, I call them engines of growth, that match that law. I call them sticky, paid, and viral. I'll just walk you through them real quick.
Yeah, please.
In the paid engine of growth, easiest one to understand. You make $1 from every customer. You do customer acquisition for 90 cents. Then you can take the 10 cents extra that you have left over, save it up till you got 10, and buy yourself an extra customer.
There you go.
So it's very simple. If customers give you enough margin to be able to afford customer acquisition, and that's scalable, then you can keep doing that over and over again, and the reinvestment will give you compounding growth effects.
Yeah.
And like all the engines of growth, paid engine of growth has only one metric that really matters, which is what is the marginal profit per customer.
Mm-hmm.
You follow that?
Yeah, absolutely. No,
Okay.
It makes total sense. So it's not an engine in that the individual is actually bringing in another individual. It's that they're giving you the margin that allows you to bring in another individual.
Exactly.
So from our end, it's the same. It's still growth that's sustainable, even though they're not actually helping us do it per se.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So viral growth is more like I think what you had in mind.
Yep.
People sometimes use viral as a synonym for word of mouth growth, but I think that's really misleading.
Mm-hmm.
Viral growth happens when the product transmission from person to person is involuntary, right? Like a virus.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be like, oh, my town is having a horrible virus, I'm going to opt out. Like, that's not how it works. It's involuntary transmission. So, if you use PayPal and you send somebody money, it's almost an involuntary reflex. You get an email that's like, hey, someone wants to give you money, click here to collect it. Like, that email is close to 100% open rate, right? Like, that's viral growth.
Uh-huh.
So in viral growth, new customers come from the actions of past customers because the past customers involuntarily infect their friends with the virus.
Mm-hmm.
And the one metric that matters in that situation is what's the viral coefficient, K-factor. I'm sure your audience is very familiar with that.
Yep.
In the sticky engine of growth, that's the domain of word of mouth. Sticky engine of growth happens when the new customers are the old customers coming back. So if you have a product with 100% retention, meaning it's so addictive that once someone starts using it, they can't stop.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine that same product had 5% a month word of mouth growth. So just, it's like TiVo, right? People just love to tell their friends about it. And, if you have 100 customers, then you're going to get 5 new customers from that.
Mm-hmm.
Then that's like having a bank account that pays you 5% interest compounded monthly. Think how rich you would be.
That's awesome.
That's such a bank account, right? Now here's the trap. Let's take that exact same example. Now imagine you had 95% retention, which sounds amazing. If you have 95% retention and 5% word of mouth, you will have 0 growth.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you're okay with that?
Probably not.
But probably not. So I meet with teams all the time that don't have a theory of growth. They haven't declared a major. They haven't said, this is our growth engine, and these are the critical metrics we look at to see if the engine is turning properly. So I've had this several times. You meet with a team that's having 0 growth, and they're very frustrated. And they come to me saying, hey, can you give us some customer acquisition tactics? How do I get more customers, more customers, more customers? And when we do the analysis through the sticky engine of growth lens, we say, look, you have 60% retention of your product, which sounds pretty good. But that means every month you're losing 40% of your customers, and because you're having no growth, you're backfilling 40% of your customer base every month. It's actually amazing customer acquisition. Mm-hmm. You don't have a customer acquisition problem, you have a customer retention problem. Mm-hmm. Fix that, and things will work. So sticky engine of growth has, again, one metric that matters, which is what is the net churn, word of mouth minus churn on a per period basis.
Yeah.
The reason I think it's so important to have one engine of growth and specialize in it is that the skills required to build a growth team around one engine of growth are specialized.
Yeah.
Very few companies, if any, that I've ever met can like walk and chew gum at the same time with this. Think about the companies that have amazing sticky engine of growth. I always think about World of Warcraft. Mm-hmm. Right? You start playing World of Warcraft, very hard to cancel. So it's amazing sticky growth. You ever seen their TV ads?
Yeah.
They're bad.
What's that?
They're bad. It's like Mr. T, and it's like...
Yeah, I vaguely remember them from like a year ago.
Like, if you compare the ad that a sticky growth company produces to like a Procter & Gamble that is like paid engine of growth all the way, right? Like their lifeblood is doing this kind of advertising.
They know how to put an ad on TV.
They know how to put an ad. So
I watch pharmaceutical ads with the lens of a marketer to learn, because I'm like, they know how to make their voice have the right cadence to ignore all the side effects. And they know how to put the right thing on the screen to make you really zoom in on the benefits. Like, they're genius because that's their engine of growth.
Yeah, evil genius, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, right. So you got to really figure out, like, what am I trying to specialize in? The true viral companies out there are amazing at viral growth, but like that's what they're amazing at. So you want to be amazing at all the engines. I've never seen that happen.
Yeah.
And it's also critical because sometimes people are pursuing an engine of growth. This goes back to the question about competition and standards.
Mm-hmm.
I meet people all the time who are feeling bad because some random metric is not as good as their competitors, and it should be better.
Mm-hmm.
When it doesn't even make sense for their business. And I'll give you an example. There was a fad a while ago that engagement was the only metric that mattered. Everyone should be measured on engagement. Retention is everything. Mm-hmm. Okay, we go through these fads periodically.
Yeah.
So some products really do matter to what their long-term engagement are, but some are not designed for long-term engagement, like a dating site. If you have a dating site with long-term retention, your customers are pissed. They want out.
That sucks.
So you cannot build a product for a dating site using the sticky engine of growth. It doesn't make sense. It can't be done.
Yeah.
You have to use the paid engine of growth, and that's why eHarmony and all these guys are masters of advertising, because the goal is to monetize in the 3 months that you're there enough money per customer to be able to afford customer acquisition. So I think it's really important, going back to have a theory of growth. You have to have an understanding of why do you deserve to have growth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is it supposed to happen? Growth is not magic. It doesn't just happen if you sprinkle the magic growth, dust on it.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you deserve growth? What engine are you trying to make work? Then what are the key assumptions that power that engine? And then how can we test those assumptions?
Yeah.
That's why this is so critical. If you want to think lean in marketing, you got to think this way, I think.
Yeah. You know what? I think the last 10 minutes of what you shared might be some of the most important things that have been shared on Growth Hacker TV. I think it's going to be the kind of thing that if they don't know they need to rewind, I'm telling you, rewind and just keep on listening until it makes sense. Or like you said, come back when you're ready, when you need it, and it'll make sense. So that's awesome. Thank you for doing that. All right, let me ask you this. Since you've published the book, what's been the most important development? Has anybody moved the conversation forward in a meaningful way? Has any concept been put out there that wasn't in the book but really matters? Or was the lean stuff you wrote so fundamental that nothing's really moved it forward in a meaningful way, And you can be honest.
I mean, look,
you can be
it's
honest.
hard. I want to be honest. It's hard to answer a question like that honestly because, of course, in my mind, every good thing that's happened since the book came out happened because the book came out. Including whatever, global warming is getting better because the book came out. Like, it's hard to.
Of course, it's connected.
Really hard to set. So like, there are a lot of people writing a lot of stuff about lean, and it's hard for me to say who's really who's advancing the state of the art and who's not, because of course I'm so focused on doing my work and applying the ideas in new and what I consider interesting ways. I don't always I don't know, maybe it's a failing, but I'm not good at kind of stepping outside of my own work and seeing what other people are doing and saying, hey, is that advancing the conversation? I don't know. I don't know how to do it.
I understand that.
No, it's fair. Like the whole growth hacking movement has grown up, in the era of lean startup.
Sure.
And I know a number of people that were involved in coining those terms and promulgating it. So and I see when I read growth hacking stuff, I see these tidbits of lean startup sprinkled in, like growth engines and stuff. But I haven't followed it closely enough to know is that just lean startup but applied in a new domain, or is there something genuinely new beyond? I don't know how to answer those questions. I leave that to historians.
No, that's fine. And honestly, I mean, I'll answer maybe a little bit for you. I think, the book, it is very fundamental, and not in a good or bad way. That's not a judgment call on it. It's just that it's fundamental in that it's fundamental. Some things, they're broad enough that a lot of activity can happen on top of them, but the fundamentals were there to let it happen. And so I think there is going to be a lot of people moving it forward, a lot of things being done, a lot of things being said. But I think the rules of engagement, the operating system, the binary code, the kernel, however you want to say it, a lot of it is in the book. And so I think that's why it's hard to really differentiate the people playing on top of it, Well,
that's very kind. And look, like I said, I really tried to build the book on the foundation of what had come before. So I am grateful to the people that build on top of this new foundation. And I really think that, because we're all primates at the end of the day, and we have a tendency to be hierarchical and want to be like, who gets credit for what and who's in charge of what, and and the person who came before is better than the person who came later. And I just think I don't know, that way of thinking really seems foolish to me.
Yeah.
I think the way you said it is exactly right. Like let's celebrate that we have accomplished something together and
Yeah.
not worry so much about who gets credit for
Well,
what.
I just think so much about Newton, building on the shoulders of giants. I mean, it's what we all do, whether we recognize it or not. So you might as well recognize it.
I know. I think that's exactly right. And I used to think that quote was really annoying as a kid, and now that I've lived it, I'm just like, God, it is so true. Like
Mhm.
whatever we've accomplished, like it's especially because when I was writing the book, I read a lot of old management books from the early 20th century. For every decade of the 20th century, I wanted to know like what did people think was management, and how are companies built. How are the great startups of the past built? Like how was the Ford Motor Company built? All this stuff, and you realize there's so much conceptual framework we take for granted
Yeah.
that allows us to do truly epic things that our ancestors who were just as smart as us could not have even attempted because the infrastructure wasn't there. Just makes you profoundly humble, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's great insight. All right, I have two final questions for you. These are the fun ones. This is a question I've been asking people because the answer is always fun. I don't know why, but what are you working on today after this interview is over? Right after it's over, what do you got going on next?
Look at my calendar. I don't know.
Yeah, tell us what you're doing.
Let's see. All right. Let's see here. Well, that's kind of depressing, so I'm not going to talk about that.
Okay.
I have a dog that is not well,
Sorry about that.
so I'm going to be dealing with that. But to answer your actual question,
Yeah, work-wise.
yeah, work-wise, well, there's two things that I'm doing today that maybe you find interesting. One, I'm trying to build a new stock exchange.
Okay,
So
small goal.
this idea called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, or LTSE, which is to say we know that the public markets are broken, and we know that the companies in them face relentless short-term pressure to make bad decisions.
Yep.
So, and we know that there's investors who are getting suboptimal returns by taking a short-term point of view. So these two trends kind of have toxic relationship with each other. You have, investors trying to invest for the long term, and you have got great companies trying to reinvent themselves for the next generation, and both are having a hard time.
Yeah.
So since we know that those two groups exist, why don't we create a new exchange where the rules would be designed to foster and incentivize long-term thinking, where we could have those two kinds of groups come together. So you'd have investors that actually believe in long-term value creation and companies that are organized that way. And we could leave behind some of the more short-term oriented aspects of today's markets.
All right, so
I'm
that's
working on
totally
that.
worth its own conversation right there that we can't get into. And now I got all kinds of light bulbs going off in my head. So
Yeah, it's like I think the current markets are more broken than people realize, and so there's an opportunity for disruption.
yeah, well, yeah, let's see what happens. That'd be exciting. All right, so last question: what is the best advice you have for any startup that's trying to grow? And obviously, you gave a lot of great advice already. But what do you want to part with? What's your final words?
I would go back to what we're talking about with science and experiments. And here's the funny thing about startups. Here's my claim. Everything you do in a startup situation, everything you do, is already an experiment. You're running an experiment right now. You ran an experiment yesterday, and you're going to run an experiment tomorrow. So I often get the question like, hey, how do I know if I should do an experiment in my startup or not? And it's like, you don't understand. It's not a choice. You are doing an experiment. Now the question is, do you want to do a good experiment, a scientific experiment, or a crappy, sloppy astrology-style experiment? Most people in startups are pretty science-oriented. Like, we tend to be science geeks, engineers. Like, not a lot of astrology believers. Not that they don't exist, but it's not as common. So I get in a lot of trouble. A lot of engineers get mad at me when they're like, hey, how dare you accuse me of astrology? And I'm like, listen, if you believe you can predict the future, that's not science. That's astrology. So if you've said, I'm about a 5-year plan, I got my plan, it says if I just do these things, these good things are going to happen, and you don't have a basis, an empirical basis to believe that, then that's not science. And if you're like, well, but my experience tells me, I'm an industry veteran, I know what's like, that's also fine, but that's not science. You can't be like, hey, I got a new breakthrough about chemistry because I thought about it real hard and my experience tells me this is going to work. You got to prove it, not just to others, but to yourself. You got to know what's really going on. So you're doing an experiment anyway. May as well make it a good one.
Yeah, that's awesome advice to end on. Eric, thank you again for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.